Hey guys, today's lecture is all about Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. So Franklin Roosevelt is the president after Herbert Hoover. He's elected in 1932, and his program, or series of programs to try and stop the ills of the Great Depression, is called the New Deal. So, Franklin Roosevelt is a wealthy man, a well-known politician who's raised in New York City. He was Undersecretary of the Navy during World War I. He was responsible for increased naval strength. He had been a vice presidential nominee. He, as an adult, was struck by polio in 1921 and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. So actually, he's our first disabled president. But he didn't want people to know that about him. He was pretty charming. He was easy to talk to, easy to get along with. He came from a very rich family. He was elected governor of New York in 1928 and 1930. And during the beginning of the Great Depression, he kind of put into place some programs for the unemployed in New York and some farmers, and that kind of attracted national attention. And he spoke frequently about the forgotten man. And even though he himself was rich, he did speak about how the regular farmer and business owner is the forgotten man in America. And those are the people that should be catered to try and help the Great Depression. He was married to Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt is actually the niece of Teddy Roosevelt, and technically Franklin and Eleanor were cousins, not first cousins, but along the line. So they were related. She didn't have to change her last name when she got married. And she kind of pushes FDR to maintain his political career even after his illness confines him to a wheelchair. And she campaigns a lot on his behalf because she's much more mobile. She's active. She has all this energy. She was much more liberal than him, though. She championed causes for women, anti-child labor, poor people, African Americans, and even some gay rights, which was very taboo during the time period in 1930s. And she was probably one of the most active first ladies in history. She had an agenda that was completely not even FDR's agenda. She kind of started this idea of a modern first lady where the first lady chooses things that she wants to do in the White House as well. She's not just a hostess and a pretty face in the White House. So there they are, Eleanor and FDR. Actually, FDR will end up cheating on Eleanor with Eleanor's secretary, and they remain married. Divorce was not an option for them, but they slept in separate beds, and they communicated more like friends from then on out. It wasn't really a loving marriage after FDR cheated on her. FDR was kind of known as like a gossipy man. He hung out with women a lot. He liked to drink fruity drinks and smoke cigars. So it's just an interesting relationship for sure. They had this communication system because she was always active and she traveled and did a lot of the traveling things in place of FDR, where he would leave. He had this basket by his bed, and they slept in separate bedrooms, and he didn't do a lot of traveling, but she did. He had this basket by his bed, and she would leave notes in the basket, and he would read them and leave a note back and put it back in the basket. He called it his Eleanor basket. So in the election of 1932, it's a landslide victory. The Democratic candidate is Roosevelt, and the Republican candidate is Hoover, and people just saw Hoover as a complete failure due to the Great Depression. Hoover, as a Republican candidate, was saying higher tariffs is going to fix this, and American free enterprise and individual initiative, and people were just done with that because they were hungry, they were homeless. So in 1932, when Roosevelt is being elected, and when Roosevelt defeats Hoover, 472 electoral votes to 59, I'm saying it's a landslide victory here. Essentially, the reality in 1932 was that so many people were struggling. They were done with Hoover, okay? We're up to 25% unemployment. For African-American males, it gets up to almost 50%. 1 in 2 African-American males had lost their job and weren't able to find one. Thousands of banks had failed. Farmers were losing their farms at an alarming rate due to mortgage foreclosures. And there's this feeling of, who am I if I can't provide for my wife and my kids or for my family? And this whole like soup kitchens and churches will help people get on their feet. Well, those places are struggling too because of lack of donations. So in comes this New Deal period. Okay, so the New Deal, first in FDR's inaugural address, well, we're not going to watch it here, but he says, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." We have to get going, essentially, is what he's saying. And he appoints a bunch of people into his cabinet, his inner circle, that are experts rather than politicians or businessmen. He pulls experts from all these different fields, and he calls it his brain trust. So we've got some notable cabinet members in his inner circle, one of them being a woman. Frances Perkins was a woman and became the first cabinet member. She was the Secretary of Labor. And we've got Harold Ickes and Harry Hopkins, and even Eleanor Roosevelt was invited to some of these brain trust meetings to try and fix the problems. So Roosevelt's first 100 days when he's in office, March through June-ish, FDR didn't really have a developed plan. He's experimenting with different programs. Some programs overlap, some contradicted, but basically Congress gave him this unprecedented power. Kind of like a blank check. Congress was like, everyone's suffering. Our constituents are telling us to do something. Roosevelt, whatever you say, we will pass through Congress. And they just comply during this first 100 days. And so many different bills are passed that start these relief, recovery, and reform programs. He also, Roosevelt does something that no other president has really done before, addresses people on the radio. Now, at this point, almost every American household has a radio. And he talks to people over the radio, and he calls him fireside chats as a means to communicate with the American people. So he would get on the radio and assure people, we're doing things. This was passed in Congress today. We're going to help. You're going to get money in the mail. You're going to find a job. It was just very reassuring. And he would explain the very complex political and economic things that he's doing in everyday language so that people understood, and they felt like the president was sitting in the room talking to them and assuring them, and that really got a lot of people on his side. So the goals of the New Deal are a bunch of programs that we can fit into these categories: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief is the idea to immediately get people food, housing, and money to get them back on their feet. Recovery is, let's fix the economy and stabilize it, get businesses going again, get banks going again. And then reform is, let's put in policies and procedures to where this doesn't happen again. We can prevent future collapses. So these are going to be the long-term things. So the short-term goals were relief and recovery, and the long-term ones were some recovery and mostly reform. So the New Deal comes in phases. The first New Deal is more relief and more fixing of banks, the recovery from 1933 to 1935. And then after the passage of all those things, there is a second New Deal as well. And the dates are kind of iffy here, but the thing about the second New Deal is less people are on his side. That in their eyes, they see that he's had 3 or 4 years to prove his point, to prove that this will work. And the second New Deal will be much more criticized, and we'll get into that. So we're not going to sort things into first and second New Deal. I'm going to sort them into based on who they're trying to help. So the banks, to help banks, FDR passes a number of, FDR and Congress pass a number of programs. And they're kind of, all of these New Deal programs are sometimes called the alphabet soup programs because they all have acronyms. So I'm going to real quick go through just a few, and we're going to go more in depth in class. So the bank holiday is all banks are forced to close down. No more withdrawing money, no more giving out loans for a certain amount of time. Once the government goes in, and this is the Emergency Banking Act, the EBA, the government goes in and fixes the ones that are good and reopens them, and then closes down for good the ones that are bad and moves all those monies to banks that are called solvent. And solvent means they're going to be okay. So the thing that the banking thing, and then the FDIC, which is still around today, this is a reform program. the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation insures your money in the bank so that when you put money in the bank, if the bank were to close, your money doesn't just disappear. It is insured by the government. All of these things increase confidence in banks so that people put their money back in banks and there aren't bank runs. So this doesn't happen again. They fixed the buying on margin issue with the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's a government body that kind of watches over the stock market to make sure no bad things are happening. Okay. Oops, sorry. With relief programs and some recovery programs, some of the ideas FDR is saying is let's get people in jobs very quickly. So the Civilian Conservation Corps is young men are invited to do conservation projects like building dams, diverting rivers, electric power, building summer camps, clearing forests and pollution and things like that. And it gives them money, and they take that money and they send it home to their families. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration gave money to states to give out to needy people. Civil Works, Public Works, and Works Progress Administration all kind of go together, and they're very confusing. It's hard to tell them apart because they're basically just jobs. Building construction jobs, dams, hydroelectric power, building government buildings, building schools. There were even some arts programs. The government would pay photographers to go out and take pictures of people suffering the effects of the Great Depression for historical record. The government paid people to go get oral histories, like Zora Neale Hurston, who you read about in your Henrietta, a Harlem Renaissance artist, went out and interviewed African Americans about their experience during the Great Depression. And some of those writings are very famous, and the government paid her to do that to get historical record. And she needed a job. So it's giving people jobs so they have money in their pocket, but they're also doing good things like building dams and bridges and schools and government buildings. And there's lots of government buildings that were built in the 30s by these programs, the CWA, PWA, and WPA, that are still around today. Part of the federal arts program that was part of the WPA included Dorothea Lange, who was a Great Depression photographer as well, and we'll see some of her pictures in class. One part of the recovery program was recovering farms, because farmers were like a quarter to a half of the United States economy anyway. So the Agricultural Adjustment Agency is all about giving farmers subsidies. So at this time, farmers were producing, but food prices were so low they couldn't sell anything, and they had all these surpluses. The Agricultural Adjustment Agency, the AAA, gives subsidies to farmers to not grow crops. And the idea here is less crops, prices go up. When farmers sell them, they make more money. Okay. Federal Farm Loan Act helps farmers get their farms back if they've lost them through cheap government loans. Rural Electrification Administration brings electricity mostly to very rural, very like backcountry areas. So it gives people jobs and gives electricity to those people, mostly hydroelectric electricity. And then the Tennessee Valley Authority was focused on where we live, the Tennessee Valley in the Appalachian Mountains. So Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, Virginia, and West Virginia, in those poor rural Appalachian areas, giving people jobs, trying to get electricity out there and energy out there, building dams, trying to stop flooding in those areas, in the areas between the mountains. And the TVA is still around today. Now, when it comes to factories, how do we get people back in factories? The NIRA is meant to prevent bad competition, prevent labor management disputes and strikes and things like that, and overproduction, so that prices don't dip, and instead prices stay the same or go up, so these manufacturers are making more. It's like a board that's composed of labor leaders and industrial leaders, and they encourage maximum work hours and minimum wage and minimum prices so that companies are able to get back on their feet and the people working for those companies actually make a living wage. The National Labor Relations Board is kind of part of that as well. So the Fair Labor Standards Act is minimum wage, essentially. It's the last of the great New Deal legislations. It established a minimum wage and a 40-hour work week for industries that were involved in interstate commerce. Remember, federal government has only the power to help with interstate commerce. So that's kind of like as far as FDR could go, but it does require a minimum wage, which is the first time that's actually happened in U.S. history. So when it comes to like purely reform, we've got a few different reforms. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, stimulates the building industry by supplying small loans to householders for improving their dwellings or buying new houses. And you can, if you are below. So the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, is still around today. It was a reform program. It gives better, cheaper, low interest loans to people who are building or buying houses to stimulate the building industry, to let people who are maybe more low income have access to housing. And it's actually still around today. So if you're below a certain income level, you can now qualify for an FHA loan, which has better interest rates. And finally, the Social Security Act of 1935. It's one of the most complicated and far-reaching laws to ever pass, but it's still around today. So it's basically to prevent the elderly from becoming the poorest population because they haven't had the chance to save their whole life because they were poor or something like that. So Social Security is something that you pay into. It's a pension. You pay into it your whole life. And then when you retire, you get a Social Security check in the mail. And that age has changed. It's basically a living wage. It's supposed to be a living wage, money per month that you get in the mail once you retire. Now, who pays for that? The working generation below you pays for that. Social Security, the Social Security Act of 1935 also allowed for old payroll tax on employers and employees, unemployment insurance, disability insurance. So it just helped people get checks who needed them because they can't work because they're retired or disabled. Okay? I'm going to click through those. All right, so some of these things happened during this time period around the same time as the New Deal. So farmers are struggling in general. In the Great Plains, farmers are struggling even more. So because of years of bad farming practices, not rotating fields, so the nutrients get sucked up, followed by droughts and bad weather, the Great Plains have this huge drought. And the topsoil that used to once be so rich and awesome for farming is just nasty and nothing is growing. There's no trees, deforestation, so no roots are keeping things in the ground. And when these big weather fronts come that are warmer and have this static electricity, they sweep up this dusty topsoil and swirl it around. And basically it rolls through the Great Plains and there's these huge dust storms. I call them black rollers. And farms just become absolutely useless. You can't plant anything. It's going to get destroyed. It's dangerous to live there. And 350,000 farmers just quit and leave the Great Plains and go try and find jobs in the Northeast or in California. And this is during the Great Depression when jobs just aren't available. And the refugees from Oklahoma and California, they were called Okies, and they were trying to escape the horrors of living in Oklahoma at the time where your farm is just going to fail. So here's an example of what would be left after a dust storm. This wagon and this car are completely buried in dust. Here are pictures of what it would look like in a dust storm. You can't really tell the horizon from like where the horizon is, the sky from the ground. When a dust storm was coming, it looked scary and ominous, and they went so fast, like 30, 40 miles an hour, just rolling on through. They could last for hours. And if you were out in a dust storm, you could die. You could be suffocated from dust or buried under dust. People trying to get to the barn to tend to their animals would tie a rope from their house to the barn before a dust storm came. And it wasn't like you could predict it. And they'd have to like pull themselves along the rope so the wind and the dust don't push them off and they don't get lost in the black and the darkness. And people would get really sick from inhaling the dust. They called it black lung, kind of like coal miners have black lung. They've just inhaled this nastiness. They'd have to cover up their mouth and nose and stuff the windows and door cracks with fabric so that the dust didn't get into their house. But many of them got sick. These photographs are actually from the Works Progress Administration Federal Arts Project. They were taken by Dorothea Lange of families in the Great Plains that are struggling. And this photograph in general is very, very famous of just the sorrow of being a mom farmer on the Great Plains, unable to provide for her children and her little baby. And this photograph is of people fleeing the Great Plains, saying, "I'm done." Okay, So, the nothing to do with the Great Depression, but a good step in the right direction for Native American civil rights is the Indian Reorganization Act of 1937. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs Commissioner goes to FDR in Congress and persuades them to repeal the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which didn't allow for tribal ownership of land and instead required Native American families individually own land. Sorry about that. So that was repealed, and all of a sudden, tribal ownership of land is allowed. The federal government now has to recognize tribal constitutions and tribal government, and allow Native American children to be educated on reservations in tribal schools. It provided loans to tribes for economic development. It ended the laws that prohibited their Native American ceremonies and dress and teaching of their language to children. And it's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. There will be a Native American civil rights movement in the 1970s that we will touch on. This is a step in the right direction of saying, like, we did something wrong to you, and now we're going to try and fix it. So the first New Deal, things are getting better, okay? The economy improved. It's not getting better. It's not fixed. It's a Band-Aid, but wages go up. Gross national product goes up. Manufacturing and salaries and wages all increase. Farm income doubles. Bank deposits, people are putting their money back in banks, and unemployment is going down. But there's going to be some hiccups. It's just a Band-Aid. It's not a permanent fix here. We'll skip that. There are people, especially during the Second New Deal, that don't like what's going on, okay? It is a very liberal agenda. Now, was it what the country needed? Absolutely. There were some people that say that the New Deal was too much, it was too much government involvement. For the first time in American history, the government is so involved in people's lives. It's providing jobs to people. It's providing checks to people. You're getting Social Security. Your money is insured in the bank. There are government workers in factories ensuring fair practices and a minimum wage. All these things, there's so much government involvement in everyday life. The president's on the radio talking to you. And some people feel that this is too much. Some economic conservatives, fiscal conservatives, believe this is way too much. One example of that is the American Liberty League. It's a group of wealthy Republicans and some conservative Democrats who think that the New Deal is socialism. And they want to defend business interests and promote open shop, type of labor practices, okay? Father Charles Coughlin is a radio host. He's initially a New Deal supporter, but then he starts criticizing it because he sees that in the IRA and the AAA, he thinks that they benefit farmers and business owners too much and sometimes benefit the wealthy farmers and business owners. Wealthy farms that are doing okay are still getting subsidies. That's not fair. He has this huge radio audience. He calls Roosevelt a liar. He says that he didn't nationalize the nation's banks. He didn't make it part of a centralized banking system. So he's a liar. That would be socialist anyway, that sort of thing. He was very popular, but then he kind of delved into too far right, and he starts getting anti-Semitic. He starts sounding kind of fascist, and very demagoguery that caused his show to eventually be canceled. Some people say the New Deal is not enough. FDR has not done enough to help people. And we're going to go through two different people here. Dr. Francis Townsend, he organized 5 million supporters for what he called the old age revolving pension plan. And this was a tax the rich plan to give old people a pension, just like Social Security, but it was going to be $200 a month per senior citizen, which was an insane amount back then. Nowadays, that's not enough. But back then, that was an insane amount. And it would be funded by a gross national tax and a huge sales tax and a tax on the rich. Some estimates had that costing about half of what the government makes in a year. So that was just way too much and it wasn't going to happen. Huey Long, some people call him Kingfish. He was the governor of Louisiana, and he created the Share Our Wealth program. And his whole slogan was, we're going to make every man a king. And his idea was take money from the rich and give $5,000 to every struggling family at the expense of prosperous families. So higher inheritance taxes, higher business taxes, those sort of things. he was pretty popular in Louisiana, where he's governor. He raised taxes to gain funds for schools and hospitals. Roads were improved, bridges were built. So he had this very liberal agenda going on in Louisiana, and he said, well, let's just take it a step further here and make every man a king. And he was assassinated in 1935 in a very interesting story with some conspiracy theory, where some people think that he wasn't assassinated and it was his bodyguards. I mean, it's a big mess. But he might have given Roosevelt a run for his money in the election of 1936 had he lived, because some people really liked this idea. $5,000, that sounds great. Okay, and there he is. So the biggest criticism of FDR came from the Supreme Court. Okay. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that. So the reason being is that FDR and Congress are passing these bills, and some of these things FDR is getting done through executive orders. And does the federal government have the power to do these things? That's up for debate in the Supreme Court, who gets the power of judicial review. So the first one of these is called Schechter versus the U.S., Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the U.S. It's sometimes called the sick chicken case because of the chickens. And the court in this case says that the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NRA, is non-constitutional because Congress wasn't allowed to delegate authority to the executive branch or to have so much say over industry. And it was brought to question by a poultry company in Brooklyn, I believe, the Schechter Brothers Poultry Company. And basically it said that congressional control of interstate commerce can't apply to this local place because it doesn't do interstate commerce. So anything that doesn't do interstate commerce, the NIRA or the NRA does not apply to, and thus is unconstitutional. So there's one instance. The next one is Butler versus the United States. So this is in 1935. And it's all about the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, giving subsidies to farmers to make them not grow crops so that crop prices go up, surpluses go away, and farmers make more money. So the court said that taking federal tax money and funneling it into the AAA was unconstitutional because of the lack of interstate, it's not interstate commerce. So the federal government can't tax businesses that bought agricultural products for the benefit of funneling that money into the pockets of farmers who receive these federal subsidies. So it's ruled unconstitutional. Well, FDR is smarter than that, and he takes the AAA and dissolves it, and then through executive order requires that states set up their own separate AAAs. So there are at this time 47 different agricultural adjustment agencies that are all set up in all the different states to get around the fact that the federal government wasn't allowed to do it. So pretty smart. Okay, so how does FDR respond to the Supreme Court? And that's just a touch on how the Supreme Court fought against these things, saying that some of the things he was doing were unconstitutional. How does he respond to that? The Judiciary Reorganization Bill, sometimes called the Court Packing Plan of 1937, it's an attempt by FDR to remove old conservative judges. They're old. They should be retired anyway. And he attempts to get this bill passed that says that justices who are 70 or older have to retire, and if they don't, another justice can sit on the court with them, up to 15 justices. Okay, this is court packing. Okay, this is trying to get people on the court who are going to say yes sir, whatever you say, FDR, because all the old conservatives weren't. 7 out of the 9 justices were 70 over, so he was going to try and put 7 more justices on the Supreme Court. And it's not passed. It makes FDR look bad. People start accusing FDR of being a dictator. He's kind of condemned for tampering with the delicate checks and balances system of the federal government. So that's like a little stain on his reputation in a sense. So the New Deal, all good things must come to an end. The second New Deal wasn't as successful. It was highly criticized. Things weren't awesome. They were better than the height of the Great Depression in 1932-33, but they still weren't back up to pre-Depression levels. So pump priming, which means just like all the reform programs, we got to get people help. All those things go away. And the second New Deal was more about the recovery and reform things. So all those all those relief programs will kind of like not fade into oblivion, because some of them are still around and were around for a while, but less importance will be stressed on them because FDR realizes that he is deficit spending. That means he is spending more money than what the government is bringing in and moving us towards more and more debt. And his idea is we need to balance the budget now. Unfortunately, taking away those job programs means all those people don't have jobs again, and it wipes out all the good that was started. So all those relief programs that were meant to be temporary needed to be restarted, such as the WPA that were giving direct aid through work programs, had to be resumed to improve the economy again in 1938. So, like I said, the New Deal was meant to be a Band-Aid, a temporary fix. And it's working while the Band-Aid is on, but when they take that Band-Aid off, when they try and like go back on some of those relief programs, then it starts bleeding again. And the Great Depression rears its ugly head again in 1938. Now, in 1938, in a congressional election, Democrats kind of lose a lot. 80 seats are lost, and this conservative coalition that are anti-FDR, anti-New Deal kind of take control of Congress and now can block FDR's legislation. And at the same time, war is happening in Europe. In 1938, 1939, Hitler is coming to power and starts bulldozing through Austria and Poland and countries like that. And the war in Europe has public attention, drawing away attention from the New Deal programs that FDR is still trying to get passed. So when we're looking at the New Deal as a whole, let's evaluate it here. It failed, right? But it worked, but it failed. Kind of a weird, like it was meant to be temporary and the temporary worked, but when you take it off, it didn't solve the Great Depression, but it helped. It makes the bureaucracy huge. The government becomes the biggest employer in the country. Hundreds of thousands of employees, the largest business. State control kind of fades into the background. Now, when people are in trouble, they look to the federal government. They look to the president for help because that was the precedent set during the New Deal. America started a new era of welfare where if people are in trouble, the government helps them out with unemployment checks, Social Security, disability checks, those sort of things. National debt, of course, is huge, right? Because we're spending more money than we're bringing in taxes. The idea of handouts, some people, very fiscally conservative people, believe that it's wrong for the government to give out welfare in a sense. They call it handouts. Critics claim that the New Deal was heading towards a planned economy, like a socialist economy, and it was far too interventionist. It got too involved in people's lives and too involved in businesses. And then the whole court packing thing was just a stain on his reputation for sure. Millions were still unemployed. It didn't cure the Great Depression, but World War II will. So when we're looking at support of the New Deal, I mean, let's talk about the good things, right? It was a good relief. It wasn't 100%. It wasn't a fix, but people weren't starving. People weren't hungry. People had homes. People had jobs. They had money coming in the mail. They had money to depend on to take care of their families. People who believe that the government is there to help you now got that. The federal government now kind of feels morally bound to help its citizens. And isn't that the point of government, right? To govern and take care, okay? The reform programs and the recovery programs, some of them are still around today, kind of helped stop future collapses. And some of those things are, they're long-term. They're effective. They still work today. Citizens were enabled to retain their self-respect and their sense of pride. They were able to work for a job, work for money, get a job. Many people didn't want the handouts, a check in the mail. They wanted to work. They wanted to feel important, like they were providing for their families, and the New Deal provided that. And lastly, the New Deal was this huge overhaul of the American system. Now the government is so involved in Americans' lives. It's kind of like a revolution, but there was no blood. It was all Americans working together to solve a problem. And the problem, it wasn't solved by the New Deal, but it really was helped by the New Deal. And so it's a sense of American spirit that we carry into World War II. And World War II will be what solves the Great Depression.